So I guess, can you walk us through what a day as a safari guide is like? Because I feel like you probably have one of the coolest jobs out there.
It depends on what kind of guiding you're doing. So, when I started guiding, I was obviously a lodge guide, and the lodge guide's life is it's quite tiring. It's a long day. You get up pretty early, sort of 5 in the morning. Depending on where you work, you'll either make coffee for your guests, or if you were lucky like I was, you just pitch up at the deck and have coffee with them. It's already been made. And then you go out on the game drive, and that can be anything from sort of 2.5 to 4 hours, sometimes even 5 hours. This is in South Africa. And when you come back after that, you'd have um breakfasts off, sometimes with the guests, sometimes on your own. But often by then the guests have had enough of you, so they don't really want to spend any more time with you just yet.
Yeah, right.
Um, and then this is where I think the good guides are separated from the average to bad guides. The good guides then will go off and they'll learn something. They'll go and read because they've got this whole chunk of the middle of the day to go and discover and find things. The bad guides will go to sleep for 4 hours before they then get up and do the whole thing again. But the real reward from guiding comes from learning and comes from improving your knowledge and improving your guiding skills constantly. And so, in that middle of the day part, you'd go off and do some reading, maybe go for a walk, depending on the weather and that sort of thing. And then you might even take a walk for some guests, although the 11 o'clock walk at the lodges is it's the strangest experience sold, because it's definitely one of the least pleasant experiences for guide and guest. So if you are going to walk a guest, I would normally do it in the morning,
Why is that?
just because of the heat.
Sure.
Nothing's moving at 11 o'clock in the morning, especially in sort of January or February. Any animal with a half a brain has gone to bed and has gone to sleep in the shade. So we'd often walk in the morning or the afternoons. Then the afternoon would come along and you would go back down to the deck and have tea with your guests and take them out on game drive again for 2.5 to 4 hours, I guess, depending on what you were finding. And you'd get back to the lodge sort of 7 o'clock-ish, depending on what you'd seen and what you were seeing and how much appetite your guests had to stay out. And then normally you'd sit with the guests until they went to bed. So you'd have drinks with them and share stories around the campfire, have a slap up meal, normally a very good meal, depending on where you work. And then you'd go off to bed sort of, I don't know, 10 o'clock, sometimes later, depending on the guest. And you do it all again the next morning. So that was a kind of typical day of a lodge guide where I worked. A lot of guys work a lot harder than that. They do the game drives, then they pack the cooler boxes, they go and do maintenance in the lodge. They'll then sit for all the meals, they'll pack drinks and that sort of stuff for the afternoon drive. And they work really hard, but I mercifully was at lodges where they had other people to do those sorts of things. So that's the sort of average day in the life of a lodge guide.
Right.
But, in my latter years as a presenter, so kind of live guide on TV or on the internet, it was, to me, the best job I'd ever had by a country mile, because it was the same two game drives, exploring, learning, same chunk of time in the middle of the day, but you had this audience of people that was so much bigger than just the 6 people on your game drive. And a lot of the time, there were people who had been on lots of virtual safaris or actual safaris. And so they had a depth of knowledge that very few people who come on safari for the first time had. And so instead of finding myself answering the same questions day in and day out, often, yes, there were the same questions from time to time, but often you get into some really great discussions with people who had a really profound interest in African ecosystems, and that was really great. And you didn't have to sit meals with your guests, which after a time becomes a little tiring if you're a bit introverted like I am.
Right, sure. But yeah, it's funny because so that's actually how I came to know of you through Safari Live,
Yeah.
and I felt like what I love most about what I observed of your presenter style is you managed to, I don't know, be make me laugh, but also I'm learning at the same time, which is
Yeah.
really, I think, unique amongst presenters. Was that on purpose or is that just you?
Yeah, I think it just comes relatively naturally to me, but it's definitely something that I've worked on and something that I think is very important for me. Not everyone, if it doesn't come naturally, that it doesn't work. So you shouldn't try and be funny
Sure.
if it doesn't come naturally to you. But I think I have a fairly sardonic outlook on life. And, it can be very tiring for people to be around someone who's cynical and sardonic. And the bush or the wilderness takes that out of my personality a bit. And as long as I use it with humor, it works quite well. And I don't know, I think that a lot of the stuff in nature, a lot of the way that people interact with nature, and a lot of the way that people talk about nature just in it's sort of a very rich ground for me to pick humor from.
Right.
And so, yeah, it was intentional, but I think it is something that I do.
Yeah, you're the only person I've ever seen that can teach me about a tree and then just like blast off like Celine Dion for a minute.
I'm not sure that's a good thing.
That's really awesome. That's cool. So I guess when you're out on drive, what animals excite you most?
Wild dogs, I've always loved wild dogs, and leopards, really. It's such a cliche to say that you like leopards, but I got to tell you, the thrill it gives me still after, I don't know, almost 20 years of being in and out of the bush, the thrill it gives me to find a leopard and spend time with it and photograph it still is, I mean, it's just like the first time it ever happened. And I really enjoy wild dogs because they don't generally lie about for too long, and so there's action and they are interacting, and so you're learning stuff about their interactions the whole time. So I really enjoy them, and obviously if they're hunting, it's tremendously exciting. And latterly, I mean, hyenas certainly came to play a major part in my enjoyment in the bush because we got to spend so much time, particularly in the Masai Mara, around their dens and learning the intricacies of the den life and the different relationships that go on there really opened a new world of discovery for me and certainly many of my colleagues.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And I guess in the vein of painted dogs, I saw this amazing footage of you just on foot on the ground
Yeah,
with painted dogs sort of darting around you. Can you
yeah.
explain what you were feeling or thinking? What was going on?
It's happened a few times. I don't know which incident you're talking about. It's probably the one where I'm sitting on the side of the road.
Correct. Yeah, that's the
Um,
one.
and yeah, we heard they were on the property. We knew the vehicles were looking for them, so we had a radio with us, and we were on foot doing a walk, a live walk. And I thought to myself, you know, let's just get into a position where they'll come past us because I've seen them on foot before. They do move away slightly, but they never run. They're not like often lions will get up and take off. You just won't see them again. Same with leopards, they'll just melt off into the bush. But dogs often get up and they just move away slightly if you surprise them and then they'll watch you. And I thought if we put ourselves in a position where they can see us, but it's on an obvious path that they're following, we might get lucky and have a great sighting. And that's what we did. They often use roads, and so we just sat on the road where we heard they were coming. And I told the cameraman who'd never seen them on foot before to just sit down and sit still and relax. And he said, is this all right? I mean, are we going to be safe? And I said, yeah, no, I'm 99% sure we'll be absolutely fine. And they came past us, and the adults barely even acknowledged our presence. They kind of glanced to the left and carried on going, and the youngsters stopped. and they were probably, how old were they? They were, I don't know, 6 months old, the youngsters. And they stopped and looked and sniffed and smelt and gave the odd sort of warning yip, if you like, and then they moved on. And the feeling that gives you is one of really kind of profound connection with something very wild. And they're not domesticated, they will never be domesticated, they're not tame in any way, you could never touch one. But this breaking of a barrier where neither of you is afraid of the other, and where there is no aggression between you, there's just a connection. They don't feel threatened, you don't feel threatened, and there's just this acknowledgement of presence is I don't know, it was just it's a tremendously powerful connection to something wild in us, I think. I mean, that's what it feels like for me.
Yeah, that's really special. I spent a lot of time down your way. I work with EWT on
Yeah,
a leopard project up in the Sophansberg, and
yeah,
all the time I spent a lot of time with, like, Zulu or Shangaan trackers, and I just feel like I'm watching you work, and I'm like, are you a wizard? Like, you're so in tune with nature. I guess being in tune with nature, I guess in the vein of that, has that changed, I guess, your perspective on life, I guess?
yeah, I think it has. You know, I grew up in Johannesburg, which is in no shape, way, or form a wilderness. Um, and when I went to the bush, I was absolutely clueless. I was never meant to end up in the bush. I went there because I was in a relationship that kind of drew me towards the bush. I was, I wanted to be a guitar player. And it was, I did know, however, from a young age that I always wanted to live in a beautiful place, even if I couldn't identify a tree or a bird. And that little seed, and it was a very small seed, found fertile ground when I moved to live in the bush, and it became an all-consuming part of me. Um, and so, yes, my perspective has changed, but it's changed in so much as obviously I've learned a lot about animals. I've learned a lot about humanity's place in wilderness, but I've also learned about, you mentioned trackers. I've learned about how um, what should we say? I'm going to say rural people in Africa interact with the wild and interact with conservation and interact with ecotourism. And walking, you say that, it looks to you that someone like me is really plugged in to nature and kind of a wizard. I mean, my skills are negligible compared with some of the local trackers who have grown up either tracking animals for food or hunting animals for food or tracking their father's cattle from when they were 4 years old. And being in the bush with someone like that, as you've spent time with good trackers, is really something else. It it's a humbling experience and one that really shows how disconnected us urbanites have become from the wilderness. I mean, I think I've managed to rekindle quite a lot of that connection over the years, but to operate with a tracker who's just so totally immersed in the wilderness that it's so much part of him that he barely notices that that's where he is a very special thing. And it triggers memories when you say that you've worked with guys like that, because it really is a privilege.
Do you have any cool memories, I guess, that would highlight what you're talking about?
Yeah, I've got a great memory of many, but the recent past, I was working with a chap called Herbert, and it was also on one of the live safaris. And before, when you're with guests, and you'll sometimes find tracks, or normally the tracker will find tracks, and you'll say, let's go off and follow these, and you'll take the rifle off the car and you'll go off and you'll follow with him. And whatever happens is off the vehicle, the guests don't see it, and you come back to the car and you get on with it and you do whatever you have to do. But on this live safari, this one morning, we knew that a lioness had a den quite close by to where we were, and we could kind of hear birds' alarm calling. We weren't really sure. And Herbert said, let's go and find this den. Now, it's quite a risk to go and find a lion den because we knew the cubs are very small. And so we knew that if she was there, she'd react in an unfavorable manner, should we put it like that. But the other risk, of course, was that we were going to go and do it while we were live on camera, which meant that if the lioness came out and charged us and we got into an interaction that was potentially dangerous either for us or for the lion, because if things got too close, then obviously Herbert, who was carrying the rifle, would have had to use it potentially. But so the risk was that we were on camera, and the risk was that we looked like a bunch of yahoos who didn't know what they were doing and who were pushing an animal for no reason at all and just trying to look great on camera, and then it goes all wrong. Anyway, I felt quite strongly that Herbert was so skilled that he would be able to do this sensitively, and so we went ahead with it. And we found some tracks quite early on, and Herbert said these are very fresh, and I believed him. There are a lot of guys who will tell you that they can tell the difference between a fresh and an old track. Half the time, I think you can safely ignore them. But a guy like Herbert, when he said it's fresh, I believed it was fresh. And so we walked along this drainage line through this sort of dry riverbed, big trees on either side, and birds calling, and we were all very tense. We're on camera. Well, we're on and off camera. So the director's cutting to us to get an update and then going back to another feed and coming back to us. And each time she came back to us, I'd say, well, they're getting fresher and fresher. And then Herbert froze. And he looked down and he said, and he whispered, and he put his hand to his mouth and he said, these things are really fresh. They're steaming. And so I started talking in this extremely soft voice to the camera, because you don't want to talk so loudly that you don't hear a lion warning you. But at the same time, it's not necessarily a bad thing that she hears you coming, because if she does hear you coming, she'll warn you. You don't want to step into the den because you've been so incredibly silent, because then you probably won't step out of the den again. Anyway, so we're walking along very quietly, and it was just amazing how sensitive Herbert was and how he stopped at each track, found every single track as she went, because he was being so careful. And eventually, while we were live, he froze and he said, there she is. And he could see just an ear sticking out of the vegetation down in a sort of shallow cave made by a curve in the river. And he could just see her ear. And I couldn't see anything at all, because I don't have that level of skill, until he pointed it out and he said, there, can you see? And I told all the viewers, Herbert can see it. And as I saw it, she stood up and her tail was flicking. And I knew that she was going to come. But because Herbert, and so I warned the viewers, I said, she's going to come at us now, but we're quite far away, so we should be fine. And because Herbert had seen her so early on, she did come. She took a few steps towards us, growled, and then we backed off very slowly, and everything was absolutely fine. Now, there's no ways, even after all the time that I've spent in the bush, that I would have had the skills yet, or maybe ever, to have been so sensitive to the freshness of the track, so sensitive to where she was. And I'm pretty sure that he, even subconsciously, was hearing the difference in the sounds that the birds make, because they'll alarm call around a lion or they'll go silent. And, I think he picked all of that up almost subliminally. And it's one of the special memories I have of being on foot with somebody just completely plugged in to wilderness.
Yeah, that's really special. Just like racking my brain, just like trying to think about like all the beats somebody has to go through to just sort of pick up stuff and be that in tune. I guess in the vein of that, have you had any other near close calls out in the bush?
Yeah, I mean, people often ask, what's the most dangerous thing that's ever happened to you? Well, I mean, and sometimes I think we're not even aware of what the most dangerous thing that's happened to us in the bush is. You've walked 2 meters from a lion's head and they've chosen not to say anything, kind of thing. I think I have no doubt I've done that countless times. Anyway, the most dangerous situation that I can remember, or the one that I'm most frightened of when I remember it, was with a group of American guests. Well, they were half American, half South African. So there were South Africans who had emigrated to America and brought some friends out on safari. And I hadn't been guiding for long, maybe 3 years or so, maybe 2 years. And I had another wonderful tracker called Elvis. And Elvis was a massive human being. He was a sort of 120 kilograms or so. I mean, they used to have to literally replace the shock absorber on the left front of the car much more regularly than they did the rest of the shocks because he was so big. And we were watching some wild dogs. It was a pack of, it was a small pack of 3 or something. And they were very agitated. And Elvis eventually spotted a leopard up in a tree. And thankfully, back when I was guiding and where I was guiding, we put the trackers in the car when there was a predator sighting. And it wasn't because we ever felt like the tracker was in danger. It was because we felt that the predator would feel like it was in danger and it would move away. You know, it's just less threatening not to have this 120 kilogram Hulk sitting on the front of the car. Anyway, he climbed in the back and we moved into the sighting, and the dogs went. The reason they were agitated was that the leopard was around and they had a den close by, and they chased this young male leopard up a tree. Now, I've seen countless young male leopards in my time, and normally they are the best kind of leopard because they're not aggressive, they are not shy either, and normally they're quite inquisitive, and so you can have amazingly close-up sightings without them being affected by your presence whatsoever. Anyway, this leopard was obviously shaken, and because he'd been chased up the tree by the dogs, and he was growling. And initially I thought, well, he's just growling at the dogs. But every so often he'd look up at us, and it just didn't make any sense. This is all in hindsight that I can see what actually happened. Anyway, leopard came down the tree and he ran from the dogs. Dogs chased him and he went up another tree. And while there were some tall trees, there was a lot of bush, and so we couldn't really see what was happening when it was on the ground. And the leopard did this 3 or 4 times. And on the 5th time, he went up a scraggly tree, and we watched, and he's growling and hissing and snarling. And he came down the tree again and he ran, and we followed in the car, and I drove around a termite mound, and I could hear that they'd caught him, that the dogs had caught the cat. And we came around this termite mound through a bush and kind of landed in this little clearing where the dogs had pinned the leopard underneath a fallen marula tree, and they were biting him, twittering and screeching, and he was snarling and hissing. And because as we came round, we probably hit a stump or made a noise, the dogs let the leopard go. And the leopard took one look at us and he came straight at the car and he jumped onto the front. And I was just frozen, paralyzed with fear. There was a guest next to me. So in the passenger seat, Elvis was at the back. And I put the car in reverse, and I reversed up, and I hit a termite mound behind us, so I couldn't go anywhere. The leopard mauled the tracker seat where Elvis had been sitting, and then he fell down onto the ground in front of the car, so close that I couldn't see him, and the dogs came towards him. And they started attacking him again, but right in front of the car. And Elvis said to me from the back, "James, you've got to move now. He's going to come again." And I said, I can't go anywhere. We're on this termite mound. Anyway, sure as nuts, he did come again. But this time he came at my door, and there isn't a door in the cars. And so he was coming straight at me. So I swung the car round and ramped up the side of the termite mound with Elvis shouting from the back, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa." Because if you flip the car over, you'll kill everybody on it. There's no roof, there's no roll bar, there's nothing. So I stopped the car again, but luckily it managed to swing it slightly. The leopard jumped back onto the bonnet, mauled the tracker seat again, dropped down off. The dogs thankfully didn't catch him as he fell off again, and they split and left a little path for me, and I just went straight through it. I must have gone over a termite mound, not a termite mound, a knobthorn tree about, 6 inches, 8 inches in diameter, just mowed it clean over and drove like hell until I was at least 200 meters away. And then I stopped. My whole body was shaking. And Elvis said, yo, from the back. He got out of his seat and he walked round to the front and he kind of dusted off his woolly hat. He always wore a woolly hat no matter the temperature. And he said to me in Shanghai, and he said, that was close. And I said, yeah, that was close. And the guests didn't say anything. They just sat there. Slowly the birds started calling again. And eventually, one by one, the guests started to almost cheer, like at a concert that's finished. And
Sure.
you're so breathtaken by its magnificence that you don't say anything. And then they were patting me on the back and patting Elvis on the back and saying how wonderful it was. And I stopped them and I said, guys, that wasn't wonderful. That's not what it's supposed to be. That's not, this is not, we're not in this for the extreme sport. We're in this to appreciate nature. Anyway, that was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened. And I realized actually that half the reason that the leopard got so angry was because we were there. And, it's interesting that there are a lot of animals that will climb trees to escape predators. So leopards will normally climb trees to get away from dogs, and often they'll just sit up in the tree there, wait till the dogs lose interest, and they'll move away. This was a nervous leopard. He was nervous of people. He was always, from the time he was born. We'd known him from the time he was a small cub, and he just never got used to people. And the only predator that animals who take refuge in trees will get out of the tree to get away from is a human being. So a leopard can walk up to a tree with monkeys in it and the monkeys will just climb higher. If you walk up to a tree with monkeys in it as a human being and pretend to look up and think about climbing, they will leap for other trees, leap down out of the tree and run. A leopard in a tree, if a human being walks towards it, will come down the tree and run. They see us as a tree climbing predator. And I've no doubt that we caused the whole problem with that leopard in the tree. If we just backed off and left him, I think he'd have gone. He just stayed in his original tree until the dogs lost interest. So that was the most dangerous thing that ever happened. And a good lesson, but only in hindsight, I guess.
Yeah, I think, and also probably the craziest story I'll hear today.
Yes, well, I hope so.
Yeah, I feel like that's just kind of like the wild though. It's either like placid and nice or like the most insane thing you have ever seen.
Yeah, sure. No, it is. And I'm torn quite often. In fact, very often, I go into the bush and I feel such a sense of peace and wonder and joy. And then I'll see a leopard catch a squirrel, or I'll see a bird catch a mouse. And I think to myself, God, that's not great for the squirrel. It really isn't. It's pretty horrific. And I think that's part of being human, is that we're able to separate ourselves from that and still appreciate it, which I think is really quite nice. Because I'm not sure that the squirrel or the mouse or the wildebeest that gets smashed by lions, or the kudu that gets taken out by wild dogs, feels anything like the sense of peace and wilderness that we do.
So,
But I think it's great that we, as probably comes from the fact that we're the apex predators, we're able to interact with wilderness in a way in which we are relatively safe, regardless of where you happen to be.
right. Yeah, and I guess in the vein of that, so I work in conservation science around large carnivores, more specifically leopards in Southern Africa. And I feel like in science, you get used to like, okay, this is a leopard. Oh, great, more camera trap shots of leopards. And I'm sure you can attest to this too. But I just feel like every now and again you can study the heck out of any animal, but every now and again they'll just surprise you. Has an animal ever surprised you in that way before?
I think they do constantly. This is a really banal example, but the sort of Bible of mammals in South Africa is the Smithers Guide to African Mammals, and in that updated version, you will find the following sentence: hyenas do not bring food back to the den for their cubs. And it's patently obvious that that's not true. But obviously, it's not something that many scientists have observed, but, we've seen it relatively frequently. And so that's a banal example of it. But I only ever saw it sort of 12 years after I'd started guiding. And that's a particularly banal example. But there are constant surprises. Animals, the old cliche goes, don't read textbooks, and they really don't. You know, you'll learn that leopards are solitary and that male leopards never interact with their youngsters, or that if they do, it's often quite aggressive. That I've seen male leopards playing with their youngsters. Um, it's just such a kind of heartwarming thing to see. You'll hear that leopards prefer to be on their own, and that they won't ever join up with relatives once they've split up. And normally that's the case, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes they do. You'll hear that an unrelated lion will really struggle to join up with a troop with another pride, and sometimes they do. So yeah, I can't think of anything wildly wildly unusual off the top of my head, but the more time you spend in the bush, as you have done, the more you realize how little the animals appreciate our interpretations of their behavior, and they're constantly surprising us with interesting things.
Yeah, yeah. I was chatting with a safari guide once at a Sabi Sands, and he said to me that he saw a leopard using like the bottom jaw of a warthog as a tool to like
Yeah.
get into the skull and get like brain material and such. I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't know if leopards can still use, but that's pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah. I've never seen that. I've never read it, but I tell you, it wouldn't surprise me hugely to hear that it was true. It surprised me hugely if I saw it, but yeah, they're intelligent animals. They're resourceful animals. That one of them had worked out how to use a tool. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me.
Sure. Living in Africa, I mean, you live in far and away, I think, probably one of the greatest wildernesses on the planet. Um, how do you feel conservation is going in South Africa?
Oof. Um,
That's a
you
very
know,
question.
it's a difficult one. I did my, I did two postgraduate qualifications, and both of them were basically on people and parks. So human beings living, the rural people living around wildlife areas. And so I came to realize how incredibly conflicted conservation areas in Africa are. That is particularly the case in South Africa for two reasons. One is that there are a lot of people here. We're pushing 55 million now, I think, and space is running out. And the other is that, most game reserves and parks were de- um, were declared and formed by the colonial authorities. And often they excluded people. So they specifically removed people from areas that they had lived in, or certainly that their families had lived in for, countless generations. Nobody really knows, because often there is no written record. And that means that conservation spaces in much of Africa, especially in the more densely populated parts of Africa, are hugely conflicted areas. And what that means is that you have you have a situation where enormously impoverished people are living around a potential food resource that they do not have access to, and that they've been specifically excluded from. And that's even more difficult in areas where there are very rich, normally white landowners who are making an absolute killing from that land. And the Sabi Sands is a great example of that. It's all owned by, I think the whole thing, yeah, the whole thing is owned by white people. And outside the boundaries of the Sabi Sands, there are probably close on 500,000 people, living close by, where there's in communities where there's a 60 to 70, probably even more than that now, percent unemployment rate. And, people are hungry. People have got no jobs, they've got no education, they've got no medical care, and yet the owners of these places are flying in, their guests are flying in and paying incredible amounts of money to stay at these lodges, and then they're flying out again. So from the perspective of a rural South African living on the boundary who doesn't have a job inside the boundary, that's a real tough nut to swallow, On the other hand, you couldn't drop the fences and say, well, everybody, you go in there and look after the place, because it just wouldn't happen. There simply aren't the education levels. It's been tried in various places. There's too much corruption. And so at the moment, the best that those people can hope for is jobs from these incredibly swanky lodges. And I feel a great deal of sympathy for the people living outside these reserves, but at the same time, I know that the solution isn't to just allow people free access and free reign, because, the place would be destroyed in seconds, because people are so poor, they really need, they need to eat, and they need wood, and they need thatching grass, and they need all sorts of other things. And, the nature of human beings is such that they'll do that before they think about conserving stuff. So that's a really tricky part of conservation in Africa. And I think that as long as populations continue to grow, especially in rural areas, I don't see that problem's going to go away anytime soon. And as long as landowners are getting far richer than the people living outside the reserves, especially when those people used to live on the reserves. I mean, I know a guy who lived in the Sabi Sands. He grew up there. And when he was about, I think, how old was he? He was about 12. He and his family were turfed out and went to live in one of the villages outside, where they didn't have access to the places they used to hunt. They didn't have access to the water they used to drink. They didn't have access to the grazing that they used to have for their cattle. And, that's a situation that's played out many, many times, not only in South Africa, but in many parts of Africa. And so I think that is the greatest challenge for conservation in Africa right now. And I think that things like the rhino poaching, while it's a massively, massively complex issue, it goes away to a certain extent when people living on the fringes of the reserves are not living in abject poverty and are not watching people deriving massive incomes from land they used to live on. And that's very simplistic, but I think in a nutshell, the most difficult thing for African conservation is the fact that there are so many poor people living on the boundaries of these reserves, and they are either being attacked by animals. So there's a huge thing with conflict animals who, elephants coming into fields and decimating a year's crop, which can drive a poor person to penury very quickly. In one night, one elephant can leave a family completely destitute, and that's very difficult to deal with. And it does, I think a lot of the time Western perspectives don't really appreciate that, and I'm not sure how much of that sort of information gets out to the West. So that in a long rambling way is what I think are the greatest challenges for African conservation.
Right. And I guess it kind of depends, because I feel like, us in like in the environmental world, we kind of live in a bubble and like little things kind of trickle out here and there. But I think for most people, their exposure to not just African wildlife, but just wildlife in general would be like, your BBC productions like Planet Earth and that and the other. And so I think the assumption is everything's fine and everything's beautiful and majestic, and it is, but there's a reality there that's kind of overlooked.
Yeah, there is. And I must say, I think that, despite the problems that there are, I think that there are a lot of African governments, there are a lot of rural African people who do a lot for conservation. They appreciate the need for it. They don't want to see animals decimated. They feel as much that animals and the wildlife of their areas are as much a part of their natural heritage and cultural heritage as they are to anyone else. But, you know, if you're poor and an elephant eats all your crops, geez, it's tough, you know.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I think that's where the next battle is. And I think that for a long time, this notion that conservation has to pay for itself and has to pay for the people living around conservation areas, I think it must fall out of favor to a certain extent. And that's pretty controversial because it hasn't done that yet. And we've been talking about involving communities and helping communities derive an income from conservation areas since the early 90s, late 80s. And I don't think it's happening, but for a very few people. And I don't know what the solution is. I think a greater involvement for local people is definitely part of the solution so that there's a sense of ownership. But I don't think that anybody with a brain between their ears can think that the conservation areas of Africa are going to provide a living for all the people living outside them, and nor are they going to pay for themselves to survive. That's such a kind of, it's a, I mean, I hate to use the term neoliberal because I can barely understand it, but it's a kind of really neoliberal way of looking at wilderness areas to decide that they have to pay for themselves when we have all the money necessary to pay for them and we just don't spend it.
Yeah, that's a raw deal. What gives you hope?
What gives me hope? I think the fact that so many people love African animals, love African wilderness, so many people are interested in it, so many local rural South Africans are fascinated by it, wanted to survive, wanted to be a part of their lives. And I think just being out in nature and seeing how it inspires people when they are out in nature, I think that gives me huge hope. And I think that even for a cynical person like me, I do see flashes of, I learn new things all the time about what people do for nature and what people who you wouldn't normally think of as being helpful to nature do for nature. And I think that, yeah, I think that gives me hope in amongst a fairly desperate situation quite a lot of the time.
Right. Yeah, just kind of everyone doing their little bit, you know.
Yeah.
Um, this is kind of a two-part question. So, you know, being out in the bush and being engaged in conservation and this, that, and the other, has there ever been a moment that gave you pause out there? And what does wild space mean to you?
Um, well, again, the story I tell quite often is that the very first time that wilderness affected me was when I was about 16. And I definitely didn't have the language to understand what had happened. And I don't really know that I thought too deeply about it at the time, but I do remember the incident. And it had nothing to do with animals. I was in the Drakensberg Mountains, and my family had been on holiday at a very nice resort, and resort in not in American terms, in a kind of South African term, you know, very countrified, you know, big country house kind of idea. And we had finished the day sort of thing, and I walked off on my own into a forest, and I knew the forest path sort of cut round to a ledge which looked down east over this valley. And it was the end of winter, sort of late August, and all the thatching grass was tall, this red thatching grass. And I remember sitting there, and I remember the way the grass moved down in the valley with the wind. I remember the taste of the dust, and I remember very clearly the sound of the silence. And it was the first time that I think I had been quieted by wilderness without any knowledge that that's what had happened. and it didn't happen again for a very long time. But it certainly that planted the seed. Um, so I'd say that that was. I mean, does that answer your question?
Yes.
That's kind of what I suppose, yeah, eventually saw me take the career path that I did.
That's very good. So we're sort of running low on time here. I just have a couple more questions real quick. So what's next for you, and where can listeners look forward to seeing you?
Um, Sadly, the live safari malarkey has come to an end. Unfortunately, it was just we couldn't fund it. Well, I mean, how do I put this? Um, let's just say the money ran out, and um, I am now the editor of an African conservation publication called Africa Geographic. Um, so that's what I'll be doing for now. I'm hoping, and we are all hoping, that that's going to include some video sometime fairly soon. And if it doesn't, you'll certainly be able to find me on my YouTube channel with my dear wife, who edits these shows called Me, My Wife, and the Wildlife, which are about our trips to various wild parts of Africa. And the latest one we did was to Botswana, all around the wild parts of Chobe and Savuti and Naipan. And so that'll be coming out sometime fairly soon. And we also did a week in Hluhluwe Mfolozi, which is in northern KwaZulu-Natal, where we worked with Wildlife Act, which is a conservation NGO that does some work up there, quite a lot with wild dogs and with cheetahs and with lions. And so we've got a little series on that coming out on YouTube as well. So if you would like to catch me, that's where you'll catch me.
Yeah, you're excited, and I've seen a bit of your show with your wife. It's very cool that you guys can do that together.
Yeah, it's great. It's wonderful. I mean, we'd both love to do it a lot more.
All right, so the last one's a little bit more fun. What is an animal impression that you think you do really well?
Well, my wife would disagree with me, but I think that I do the alarm call of a plain zebra extremely well. Would you like me to do it for you?
I'd be thrilled.
All right, yes. So here it goes.
That's
I think
remarkable.
that.
Is zebra in your house?
No, but there are people rushing out from the flats next to me, looking for lions and zebras.
I like to think I do an okay like wild dog contact call where they just sort of go, woo, 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 woo.
Yes, that's very good, actually. That's very good. I'm glad there aren't any around me, for surely they would come.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the show with just one last question here.
Okay.
If you could send everyone on Earth a text with a conservation message, what would it read?
Oof, a text with a conservation message. And it would have to be quite short because people don't read anything these days. I would say, gosh, how would I do it? The essence of it would be get into a wild place, doesn't matter where it is, doesn't matter what animals are there, and connect, just be. So how would I say that more succinctly? I think that I would probably say something like appreciate nature and connect. And yeah, it would be appreciate nature and reconnect with nature. No matter where you are in the world, nature is fighting to connect with you. So it might be a piece of grass that's growing out of the pavement. It might be an earthworm you find in your garden. It might be a bird that flies over the city. But connect with a little piece of nature, because there's a wild part in every one of us, and it's yearning for a reconnection. There you go.
That's good. That feels right.
Okay, good.
That's very good. That's cool. Well, hey, awesome. Yeah, hey, this is a really fun conversation. Thanks for coming on today. And yeah, we look forward to seeing what's next for you.
Absolute pleasure, and thank you very much for having me.
Excellent. Yeah, maybe I'll have you again soon. I guess until then,
Yeah.
stay wild then, hey?
Ooh, you too.
Okay, we'll do.
All righty.
And